That's a lie. No one who loved your wife would demand your life savings at an ATM.
Mr. Keene?
Wait, you two know each other?
Knoxville, Tennessee. A Saturday evening in October. The kind of restaurant where people celebrate wine list, framed prints of the Smoky Mountains on wood-paneled walls. Tyler Keene had his life to each other. He had no idea they had already met in a strip mall parking lot. Walter Keene had lived alone in the same brick ranch house on Westwood Avenue for 6 years. Since Helen died, he had maintained the house the way she would have wanted it. Gutters cleaned in October, storm windows swapped in November, the garden bed along the front walk weeded every Saturday morning before it got too hot. He went to the hardware store on Mondays. He ate lunch at the same diner near the university on Wednesdays. The booth by the window, the club sandwich, the unsweetened tea. He drove his truck to the grocery store on Fridays and bought exactly what he needed for 7 days. His routine was a fortification. His routine was the only thing standing between him and the silence that filled the house after 6 o'clock every evening. Helen had handled the finances. The bills, the statements, the insurance, all of it had been hers, organized in a filing cabinet in the hallway closet with color-coded tabs she had made herself. When she died, Walter taught himself to do it. Badly, carefully, out of pride. He would sit at the kitchen table on the first of every month with her old calculator and a yellow legal pad and work through the numbers the way a man works through an engine repair manual, step by step, trusting the process even when he doesn't fully understand the machinery. He was not bad with money. He was bad with money the way a man who speaks only English is bad with French. He could get through a transaction, but he could not have a conversation. And the people who target men like Walter know the difference. They can see the hesitation. They can smell the gap between competence and confidence, and they walk right into it. Tyler called every Sunday evening. Tyler was 31, taught history and coached football at a high school 20 minutes away, and had her perhaps a dozen times. Walter had said each time, "She sounds fine." He had not asked to meet her. He had not asked questions. Tyler took this as approval. It was not approval. It was avoidance. Walter did not know how to meet someone new. He had met Helen in 1978 and never had to do it again. The house was adequate. The routine was adequate. The Sunday phone calls were adequate. Walter Keene had built a life that was entirely adequate and entirely empty, and he did not know how to fix it, because the only person who had ever known how to fix that kind of emptiness was in a silver frame on the hallway wall. 6 weeks before everything changed, Walter saw a flyer taped to the bulletin board at the West Side Community Center. Free retirement planning seminar. Protect what you've built. He went because it was a Tuesday, and he had nothing after lunch. He drove to the community center and parked between a minivan and an older sedan and walked inside and sat in a folding metal chair in a room that smelled like industrial coffee and floor wax. The presenter was a man named Ray Hendricks, early 50s, charcoal blazer over an open-collared shirt, a leather portfolio on the card table beside the coffee urn. He spoke to the room of 15 retirees like they were colleagues, not targets. He used phrases like "people like us" and "the system wasn't built for folks who did it the honest way." He made eye contact. He used first names. He remembered the details people mentioned, their companies, their years of service, their plans for the grandchildren. Ray Hendricks was not a financial advisor. He had never and the leather portfolio contained nothing except blank paper and photocopied forms designed to look like regulatory documents. But Walter did not know any of this. Walter saw a man who spoke clearly, dressed professionally, and seemed to understand what it was like to be 67 years old and responsible for money you did not fully understand. Walter stayed after. Most people drifted out. Ray was in no hurry. He shook Walter's hand, a soft, patient handshake, the kind that doesn't try to prove anything. And he said, "Mr. Keene, it sounds like you've built something solid. I'd love to help you make sure nobody can touch it." He gave Walter a business card, cream-colored cardstock, embossed lettering, Hendricks Financial, protecting what you've built. Walter put it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a trout that Helen had bought in Gatlinburg in 2004. The magnet had been holding a grocery list in Helen's handwriting, the last one she ever wrote. Now it held Ray's card, and the grocery list hung slightly below it, like an afterthought. The card stayed on that refrigerator for 6 weeks. It was still there the night everything fell apart. And every morning for those 6 weeks, Walter walked past it and poured his coffee and looked at the trout magnet and Ray's card and Helen's grocery list. And he thought, that man is looking out for me. He thought it with the same certainty with which he thought Helen would have liked him. He was wrong about both things. But the wrongness felt exactly like the truth, because Ray Hendricks had spent 15 years learning how to make the wrong thing feel right, and Walter Keene had spent 6 years with nobody to check his thinking except 2 weeks after the seminar. Ray Hendricks sat at Walter Keene's kitchen table for the first time. He had called ahead, he had been polite. He had said, "Mr. Keene, I'd love to stop by and do a free portfolio review. No obligation, no pressure, just a second set of eyes on your accounts." Walter said yes because the man had been right about several things at the seminar, about how banks restructure accounts without notification, about how pension buyouts were being quietly reclassified, and because nobody had sat at that kitchen table across from Walter since Doris brought the casserole last month. Ray was patient. He was respectful. He called Walter sir. He did not rush. He reviewed the bank statements with the careful attention of a man who genuinely cared about the numbers, and the numbers told a story. $187,000 in a savings account at a regional bank, Helen's life insurance payout, Walter's pension buyout from 34 years at the same manufacturing plant, and 3 decades of small deposits, $20 here, $50 there, that had accumulated the way sediment accumulates, quietly, until there was something solid underneath. That number, 187,000, was not a fortune. It was not retirement on a yacht. It was retirement in a brick ranch house with the heat set to 68 in winter between Independence and Dependence. It was the difference between Walter Keene choosing his own life and Walter Keene having to move in with his son and sleep in a guest room and eat meals someone else cooked, at times someone else decided. To Walter, $187,000 was not money, it was dignity. Ray identified the account. He took notes. He said he would run some projections and come back the following week. He took a photograph of the bank statement for his records. It has a clinical name because it happens so often that it needed one. Ray did not invent the technique. He learned it the way a carpenter learns joints, through repetition, through practice, through the understanding that every human being has a structural weakness, and the structural weakness of a grieving widower is always the name of the person they lost. Walter talked about Helen because Ray asked about Helen. Walter showed Ray the filing cabinet because Ray admired it. Walter pulled out the color-coded tabs and explained the system because Ray said, "Mr. Keene, this is the most organized system I've ever seen in a private home." It was flattery. It was specific, patient, calculated flattery. And it worked because Walter Keene had not been good in the summer of 2019, and he had said, "You planted it, I just water it." The fact that no bank had ever called him about a restructuring in 34 years. But then Ray said the words that dismantled the last of his defenses. "This is what Helen would have wanted you to do, Mr. Keene. Protect the account, protect the house. Do it for her." Walter asked what he needed to do. Ray told him, "Come to the bank, initiate a wire transfer, move the money to a protected holding account." The account number was ready. Ray would walk him through it on the phone. Tuesday afternoon. Tomorrow. Walter wrote down the account number on his yellow legal pad. His handwriting was neat, the same block letters he had used for 34 years of quality control reports, the same careful precision he brought to everything. He wrote the number, and he set the pen down, and he looked at it. Some part of him, the part that had worked quality control for 3 decades, the part that had been trained to identify deviations, the part that knew the difference between a process that was right and a process that looked right, some part of him knew. But that part was buried under 6 years of loneliness, 6 weeks of trust, and a voice on the phone that sounded like the kind of man Helen would have trusted. He went to bed. He did not sleep. Tuesday, 1:45 in the afternoon. Kingston Pike Strip Mall. The parking lot was the kind you stop seeing after you've driven past it 1,000 times. A nail salon, a tax preparation office, a vacant storefront with brown paper taped over the glass. 3 cars in the lot, an idling delivery truck in the fire lane. The sun flat and high, burning off the last of the morning haze. The bank was at the end of the strip, next to a dry cleaner that had been closed for 2 months. Walter Keene sat in his pickup truck in the far corner of the lot, engine running. He was on the phone with Ray. His hands were shaking, not from cold, not from age, but from the feeling that something was wrong, and he could not name it, because the man on the phone sounded exactly like the kind of person Helen would have trusted, and Walter had been using Helen as his compass for 6 years, even though the compass had stopped working the day she died. Grace Kerrigan was 2 lanes over, idling behind the delivery truck on a routine Tuesday patrol when she saw the pickup. "I'm on the phone." "I can see that. You look like you're having a hard conversation." "It's private." "Yes, sir. Can I ask who you're talking?" "Sir, step out of the vehicle. Just, who are you talking to?" 3 years on the community beat had taught Grace that dignity was the most effective tool she carried. People did not respond to commands. They responded to being seen. And Walter Keene, in that moment, was a man who needed to be seen, not as a suspect, not as a victim, but as a person who was making a decision he might not be able to unmake. Walter hesitated. He said, "My financial advisor." Grace nodded. She said, "Has he asked you to move money today?" Walter's face changed. The annoyance drained out of it like water through a crack. The urgency, the deadline, the invocation of the deceased spouse, the holding account in another state, the insistence on doing it right now, today, before the window closes. It was the same script she had heard in the training videos, and it was happening in real time in a parking lot on Kingston Pike. She said calmly, "Sir, I'd like you to hang up the phone, and then I'd like to walk with you into Dank. Not to do anything, just to ask one question at the counter." Walter hung up. They walked inside together, the old man and the young officer, side by side, not speaking. The bank was quiet. 2 tellers, a waiting area with plastic chairs, a water cooler, a television tuned to the news with the sound off. Grace asked the teller to check for pending outgoing $7,000 to an account registered in Delaware. Walter sat in a plastic chair and said almost nothing. His hands were flat on his thighs. He was staring at the carpet. He was not processing what had happened to him. He was processing what he had almost done. When they were done, Grace handed him her card. She said, "You did the right thing, Mr. Keene. You stopped it." Walter took the card. He did not look at her. He said, "I should have known." She said, "That's what they count on, that you'll blame yourself instead of them." He did not answer. He put the card in his shirt pocket, the same shirt pocket that Tyler's fiancé would notice 4 days later at a dinner table, and walked to his truck and drove home. Grace went back to her patrol car, sat for a minute, and wrote the incident number on her notepad. She radioed the disposition. Then she finished her shift. She had saved 340 people in 7 years on the force. Traffic stops that prevented accidents. Welfare checks that found people in time. Domestic calls where the right words in the right tone prevented the wrong outcome. But this one was different. This one stayed. The look on the man's face when she asked, "Has he asked you to move money today?" That look. The way the annoyance drained and the fear moved in. She had seen a man realize, in real time, that the person he trusted was the person stealing from him. That look does not leave you. She drove home. That evening, Grace came home to Tyler's apartment. She was tired, in the way that settles behind the eyes and stays. She dropped her duty belt on the hook by the door and sat on the couch and told Tyler she'd had a rough call. An older gentleman, almost lost a lot of money, but we caught it. Tyler looked up from the papers he was grading. That happened a lot. More than you'd think. 3.5 million Americans over 60 get hit by financial fraud every year. Most of them never report it. The ones who do, a lot of them are too ashamed to give the full story. They blame themselves. They think they should have known. Is the guy okay? He'll be okay. He reminded me of somebody's dad. She described Walter to Tyler's face. She said, proud, old-fashioned, the kind of man who irons his shirts and polishes his boots and sits at the kitchen table with a legal pad doing the math by hand because that is how he has always done it. Tyler said, "Saturday's the dinner. Dad called. He said he wants to sit in the corner booth. He wants to order the wine himself. I think he's nerve-died. He doesn't know how to do this." Grace put down the tea. "Neither do I." Grace's father had walked out when she was 11, not dramatically. No slammed door, no shouting, no scene. He just stopped coming home. The first night, her mother said he was working late. The second night, she said he was at a friend's house.
The third night, she said nothing. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at her hands, and Grace stood in the doorway in her pajamas and understood, at 11 years old, that the man who was supposed to be there was not going to be there anymore. She had no model for what a good father-in-law looked like. She had no model for what a good father looked like.
She had been studying fathers the way an anthropologist studies a culture she was not born into, and now she was about to sit across a dinner table from one and ask him, without saying the words, to accept her into his family. Tyler said his father was old-fashioned, stubborn, and impossible to argue with. Grace smiled. She said, "Sounds like half the people on my beat." Tyler laughed. He did not notice that her smile faded the moment he looked back at his phone. He had never seen before, approaching from the passenger side, asking one question that cracked the whole thing open. He sat there for 2 hours. He was not processing what Ray had done to him. He was processing what he had almost done to himself. He had given a stranger his bank credentials. He had believed a man who used his dead wife's name as a tool.
He had come within 11 minutes of losing the house Helen chose, the savings Helen built, the safety net that was the only thing standing between Walter Keene and dependence on his son, which to Walter was worse than poverty, worse than loss. Dependence meant admitting that the wall he had spent 67 years building was not strong enough. Dependence meant the end of the story he had told himself since he was 18 years old. I can handle it myself. He went to bed at midnight. In 4 days, he would sit in a restaurant booth and extend his hand to a young woman in a navy dress, and discover that the officer who had saved his life savings was the same woman his son wanted to marry. He did not know this yet. What he knew was that someone had seen him at the
Saturday evening. The restaurant was a Knoxville institution, the kind of place where the town went to celebrate things that mattered. Cloth napkins, a modest wine list, framed photographs of the Smoky Mountains on walls paneled in dark wood. The booths were deep and private, separated by frosted glass dividers. The hostess knew the regulars by name. Tyler had reserved the large corner booth. He arrived first, because Tyler arrived first to everything. It was the coach in him, the man who taped the field before the players showed up. He straightened the silverware, he checked the wine he had ordered, he checked his phone. He was beaming. This was the dinner he had been planning for 2 months. The dinner where the two people he loved most would meet each other, and he hoped would recognize in each other what he recognized in each of them: steadiness, decency, the willingness to show up. Walter arrived with Doris, who had insisted on coming for moral support, and because she had told Walter she would assess the situation. Walter was wearing the ironed button-down, the good one, the one Helen had bought him for their 30th anniversary, the one he kept on a wooden hanger in the closet, wrapped in a dry cleaning bag, even though it had never been to a dry cleaner. He had polished his boots, he had combed his hair. His face was set in the careful, neutral expression he had used for 34 years of performance reviews and quarterly audits. Grace was wearing the navy dress. She had bought it 3 days ago. She had tried on 4 others. She had stood in front of the mirror in the dressing room and asked herself whether this was the kind of dress a 67-year-old widower from Knoxville would want his son's fiancé to wear. And then she had told herself to stop asking that question and just pick the one that fit. The navy dress fit. She wore the small earrings her mother had given her for her academy graduation. She wore her hair down, Chin length because Tyler said it looked nice that way, and because she wanted to look like herself and not like a police officer at a formal event. She walked into the restaurant, Tyler's face of a man who has been waiting for this moment and believes it will go well because he has not been given a reason to believe otherwise. He turned to the table. "Dad, this is Grace." Walter stood. He was wearing the iron shirt. His face was set. He extended his hand across the tablecloth, a formal gesture, the kind of handshake a man offers when he has decided to do this correctly. Grace stepped forward. She saw his face. She saw the hand. She saw the shirt pocket, the same shirt pocket where he had put her card 4 days ago in the side office of a bank on Kingston Pike. The same shirt, the same pocket, the same man. Her hand stopped mid-reach. The blood left her face. "Sir?" Walter's hand was still extended. His eyes were locked on hers. He recognized her. Not immediately, not in the first half-second, but in the second half-second, when the context shifted and the woman in the navy dress became the officer in the parking lot, and the restaurant became the bank, and the hand he was extending became the hand that had reached for her business card 4 days ago in a windowless office while he stared at the carpet and said, "I should have known." 8 seconds of silence. Tyler's smile faded. He looked from Grace to Walter. He said, "Wait, you two know each other?" Nobody answered. Doris set down her water glass very slowly. Linda looked at Grace's face and knew immediately that something was wrong, in the way that mothers know, not because of the evidence, but because of the absence of the expression that should have been there and was not. Grace recovered first. She always recovered first. It was the training, the 3 years of reading rooms and managing crises, and putting her own reactions in a box until she had time to open it later. She took Walter's hand and shook it. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were asking him a question only he could hear. "Do you want them to know?" Walter understood the question. He shook her hand. He said, "Pleasure." He sat down. He picked up the menu. His hands were steady. His jaw was not. Walter asked Grace about her work. "Tyler tells me you're in law enforcement." She said yes, Community Patrol Division. He nodded. He did not mention the parking lot. She did not mention the parking lot. They both held the secret in the space between their words, and the table ate, and Doris carried the conversation with the relentless energy of a woman who had been to enough awkward dinners to know that silence was the enemy. Tyler noticed something. Grace said, "Yeah, I think so." She kissed him. She drove home. She sat in her car for 10 minutes with the engine running. She put both hands on the steering wheel and she breathed. She breathed the way she breathed after the hard calls, the ones that stayed, the ones that followed her home, the ones that sat in the passenger seat on the drive back and did not get out when she parked. Then she went inside and took off the navy dress and hung it in the closet and lay down and stared at the ceiling until sleep finally came. Walter drove home with Doris, who said, "She's lovely, Walter. She's exactly what Tyler needs." Walter said, "She seems fine." Doris said, "Oh, for heaven's sake." Walter said nothing else. He went inside. He sat at the kitchen table. He did not turn on the lights. He sat in the dark and looked at the chair where Grace had not sat, but where he could imagine her sitting, with her legal pad and her recorder and her steady questions. And he thought, of all the officers in this city, of all the parking lots, of all the people in the world who could have stopped and tapped on that window and asked one question,
that saved my life. It was her, Tyler's Grace. He did not know what to do with that. He did not know whether to be grateful or ashamed or afraid or all three at once. He sat in the dark and he held all three at the same time, the way a man holds a handful of broken glass, carefully, because putting it down means choosing which pieces to keep.
The next week, Walter withdrew. He did not call Tyler for their Sunday conversation, the first time he had missed it in 4 years. Tyler called him. Walter said he was busy with the yard. Tyler asked about Grace. Walter said, "She seems fine."
The same words he had used for 2 years, but now they carried a different weight, the weight of a man who had seen Grace Currigan at work and could not reconcile that competent, steady officer with the nervous young woman who had shaken his hand at a dinner table. Except that was wrong. He could reconcile them. He could see that the officer and the woman were the same person, and that was the problem. The woman his son loved had seen him at his lowest moment. She had seen the fear. She had seen the shame. She had seen the man in the plastic chair who could not look up from the carpet. He was not rejecting her. He was trying to figure out how to look at her without seeing the parking lot. Grace gave him space. She did not call. She did not drive past his house on patrol. She thought about it and decided it would be crossing a line she had drawn for herself. The line between the officer who had helped him and the woman who wanted his respect.
She told Tyler to be patient. She said, "Your dad is processing." What she did not say was, "Your father is a proud man who just discovered that the woman joining his family, he is trying to figure out how to be in a room with me without feeling like the man in the plastic chair staring at the carpet in a windowless bank office." Tyler was caught between them. He did not understand the silence. He did not push, because his mother had taught him, before she died, in the years when she was still teaching him things, that the people you love will tell you the truth when they are ready, and pushing before they are ready is a form of selfishness disguised as concern. On Wednesday, 5 days after the dinner, Doris came over with a casserole. She sat at Walter's kitchen table, which was becoming the place where every important conversation in this story happened, and she looked at Walter with the expression of a woman who had known him for 20 years and had watched Helen's photograph on the shelf collect dust and had promised Helen in the last months that she would keep an eye on him. "Walter," Doris said, "that girl saved your retirement, and you're acting like she insulted your mother." Walter said, "I don't want to talk about it." Doris said, "Helen would have adored her." Walter said nothing. He looked at Helen's photograph on the shelf, the silver frame, the warm smile, the garden she had planted behind her. Doris left. The casserole stayed on the counter, untouched until midnight, when Walter cut a square and ate it standing up at the sink, because sensation was still echoing in the room like sound in a cathedral. His son's happiness, his future daughter-in-law's respect, the chance to have a family again after 6 years of eating alone at this table with only the clock for company. The thing about pride, the specific, particular pride of a man who raised his son alone after his wife died, who paid off his house, who never asked anyone for anything, who changed his own oil and mowed his own lawn and did his own taxes with a calculator and a legal pad, is that it looks like strength from the outside. From the inside, it looks like a wall, and walls keep things out, but they also keep you in. Walter Keene was standing behind a wall he had spent 67 years building,
and the only door was the one thing he had never learned how to do: ask for help, accept help, admit that the help was needed, admit that the person who gave it did not diminish him by giving it. Helen would have known what to do. Helen would have called Grace the next day. Helen would have made coffee and invited her to the kitchen table and said, "Thank you for saving my husband from himself." Helen would have done it with grace and warmth, and the specific, uncomplicated generosity of a woman who understood that accepting help was not weakness, it was trust. And trust was the thing Walter had been trying to rebuild for 6 years, and the thing Ray Hendricks had exploited, and the thing Grace Kerrigan had restored, and the thing Walter could not bring him.
On Thursday evening, 12 days after the rescue, 6 days after the dinner, Walter called Grace. Grace was in her patrol car at the end of her shift, parked behind a gas station on Chapman Highway, eating a granola bar and finishing paperwork. Her phone showed an unknown local number. She answered the way she answered every unknown number: quick, professional, ready. "This is Walter Keene." Grace straightened in her seat. She set the granola bar down on the dashboard.
She turned off the patrol radio. She held the phone against her ear, and she waited. Because she had learned from 3 years of difficult conversations that the most important thing you can do in the first 5 seconds is nothing. "Mr. Keene, how are you?" "I'm fine. I want to ask you something." "Of course." He did not thank her. He did not mention the dinner. He did not apologize for the silence. He asked a question. "That man, the one with the portfolio, how did you know?"
How did you know he was lying? This was the question. Not, "Why did you help me?" He knew why she helped him, because it was her job. The question was how. How did she see what he could not see? How did she hear the lie in a voice that sounded exactly like sincerity? This was a quality control question. This was the question of a man who had spent 34 years identifying defects and deviations, and who could not accept that the biggest defect of his life had passed his inspection.
Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she told him. She told him about the FBI training, about the pattern, the urgency, the flattery, the manufactured crisis, the use of a dead spouse's name as emotional leverage. She told him that these operations targeted widowers and widows through church directories, community center sign-up sheets, and neighborhood newsletters, the same places where people go to feel less alone.
She told him that the account in Delaware had been flagged and that federal investigators were building a case. She was careful. She did not speak to a colleague, clearly, precisely, with the respect of someone who assumed he could handle the truth. She used the word pattern often because she knew that a man who had spent 3 decades in quality control understood patterns.
She framed the scam not as a failure of Walter's judgment, but as a success of a system designed to exploit trust, a system with inputs and outputs, and a process that had been refined over 15 years to produce exactly the outcome Ray Hendricks had almost achieved. Walter listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked a second question. "How many people like me does he do this to?" Grace said, "I don't know the exact number. The FBI estimates hundreds per ring."
But the ring targeting East Tennessee, based on what the investigators have found, is at least 11 other families, widowers mostly, some widows, same pattern, community center seminars, church directories, free workshops at the American Legion and the VFW posts. They find people who are alone, and they offer them the one thing they cannot refuse: someone who listens. Walter was quiet for a long time. Grace let the silence hold.
She had learned that silence was not emptiness. Silence was where people made decisions. She waited. The gas station lot was empty. The streetlights were coming on. The evening was doing what evenings do, getting dark, getting quiet, closing the distance between the day and the night. Then he said, "I would like to help." Grace blinked. "Help how, Mr. Keene?" "I kept everything. The card, the emails, the notes from when he came to the house."
My phone has every call he ever made to me, the dates, the times, the duration. I wrote down what he said after every visit, not because I suspected anything, but because that's what I do. I document things. I've done it for 34 years. I want to give you all of it. This was the pivot. Not gratitude, participation. Walter was not saying thank you. He was saying, I was targeted because I was alone, and I do not want to be alone with this anymore. He was saying, I have skills. I have X. The defect got past me this time, but the documentation is intact, and the documentation can help catch the man who did this. And catching the man who did this can protect the 11 other families he has targeted. The phone call that took 12 days to make lasted 45 minutes. By the end of it, Walter had agreed to organize his materials, and Grace had agreed to come to his house on Saturday morning to go through everything. She would bring a legal pad and a digital recorder. She would not bring Tyler. Walter did not invite him. This was between the two of them, the man who had almost lost everything, and the woman who had stopped it. Grace said, I can come by this weekend, if that works. Walter said, Saturday morning, I'll have coffee on. There was a pause. Then Walter said something he had not planned to say. He said it the way men of his generation say things they have been thinking about for days and cannot hold any longer. Quickly, before the moment passes, before the wall goes back up. You handled it right. In the parking lot. You handled it exactly right. Grace was quiet. She looked through the windshield at the gas station lot, at the ordinary evening light, at the world going about its business. Thank you, Mr. Keene, she said. That means a lot. He said, you handled it right. And she heard what he meant. He meant, I see what you did. I see how you did it. I see that you chose dignity over authority and patience over force, and that you let me keep the one thing the scam could not take, the ability to say, I stopped it. You handled it right. 4 words from a man who did not give compliments. From a man who had not complimented anyone since Helen told him the garden looked good, and he said, you planted it, I just water it. 4 words that took 12 days to arrive and would stay with Grace Currigan for the rest of her career, longer than any commendation, any citation, any performance review. She started her car. She picked up the granola bar and took a bite. She drove home. For the first Saturday morning, Grace drove to Walter's house on Westwood Avenue, for the first time as herself, not as an officer, not as Tyler's girlfriend, but as the person Walter had called. She parked on the street. She carried a legal pad and a digital recorder. She wore jeans and a pullover sweater. No uniform, no badge. She knocked on the front door. Walter opened it. He was wearing a flannel shirt, and he had made coffee, a full pot, 2 mugs set out on the kitchen table. The table. The same table where Ray had sat. The same table where Walter had sat in the dark for 2 hours after the rescue. The same table where Doris had delivered her casserole and her verdict. Everything in this story happened at that table. But now the table looked different. Walter had organized everything. The emails printed and dated, the business card removed from the fridge and placed at the top of the stack,
his handwritten notes from Ray's visits arranged chronologically, the bank statements with Ray's markings still on them, his phone with the call log open, showing dates and durations. He had been preparing for this.
He had spent 3 evenings doing what he had spent 34 years doing at the manufacturing plant, documenting the process, identifying the deviation, building a record that could not be disputed. The table looked like a case file assembled by a man who did not know how to build a case file, but built one anyway, out of the same careful precision he had spent 34 years bringing to quality control. Every email was in order. Every note was dated.
She did not react to the parts that should have made her angry, the exploitation, the patience of it, the 6 week of Helen's name as a crowbar. She kept her face professional and her pen moving, because this was Walter's story, and Walter needed to tell it his way, in his order, at his pace. When they were 90 minutes in, Walter said something that made Grace set her pen down. He knew Helen's birthday. I don't know how. I never told him. But on the 4th visit, he said, "Mr. Keene, your anniversary is coming up. October 22nd, isn't it? Her birthday." But he had known. He had known the date. I didn't question how. Grace wrote it down. She wrote, "Suspect obtained personal dates, possible public record search, obituary data, or social media of family members." He was not expected. He had driven over to check on his father because the missed Sunday call had been bothering him for a week, and he could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had told himself, on the drive over, that he was overreacting. He had told himself that his father was fine, and that the silence after the dinner was just his father being his father, old-fashioned, stubborn, impossible to argue with. He had told himself all of this, and none of it had worked, because Tyler Keene was a history teacher who had spent his career teaching students that ignoring the evidence does not make it go away. He saw Grace at the kitchen table, his father's kitchen table, surrounded by documents, his father speaking into a recorder. Tyler stood in the doorway. "Dad, what is this?" Walter looked at his son. For the first time, he told Tyler what happened. All of it. The seminar. Ray. The phone calls. The home visits. The parking lot. At this table, who had shaken his hand at a restaurant 6 days earlier, while holding a secret that could have humiliated him in front of everyone. The wire transfer that was 11 minutes from going through. $187,000. The house. Helen's money. Everything. Tyler listened. His face went through 4 colors. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased and soft from 3 weeks of being carried, 3 weeks of being touched through the fabric, 3 weeks of being held like a question the holder was afraid to ask. The email printout. Subject line, "Urgent, account protection required." "Dad," he said, "I found this 3 weeks ago, in your recycling. I should have said something." I looked at it and I told myself it was nothing, and I put it in my pocket, and I never... He could not finish. Walter looked at the paper. He looked at his son. He saw the guilt. He saw the shame. He saw in his son's face the same expression he had seen in his own reflection in the hallway glass 2 weeks ago, the face of a man who believed he should have known, who believed he could have prevented something, who believed that silence was a choice, and the choice was wrong. "You couldn't have known," Walter said. "I should have asked. I should have told you. Grace sat between them and said nothing. She did not need to. The table held the three of them and all the things they should have said. Walter's pride, Tyler's guilt, the email that had lived in a jacket pocket for 3 weeks, because looking at it meant admitting that something was wrong with a man who had spent his whole life insisting nothing was wrong. 3 weeks later, Walter's case file was submitted to federal investigators through Grace's department. The file was 43 pages, printed emails, handwritten notes, call logs, bank statements, a timeline of every visit and every phone call, organized with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 34 years ensuring that things met specification. The investigator assigned to the case called it the most organized victim file we have ever received from a civilian. The investigator shook Walter's hand and said, "Mr. Keene, you made our job considerably easier." Walter said, "I had help." He did not elaborate. The investigator did not ask. Ray Hendricks, whose real name was Raymond Hinkle, was arrested in connection with 11 other cases across East Tennessee. Widowers and widows, targeted through church directories, community center sign-up sheets, and free seminars at American Legion halls and VFW posts across 3 counties. The total estimated loss across the ring was $4.2 million. 7 families had lost their savings. 4 more, Walter included, had been intercepted before the transfers completed. Walter's documentation provided the timeline, the methodology, and the pattern that connected the cases. The trout magnet on the fridge, holding nothing now. Helen's grocery list was in the case file. The business card was in an evidence bag. The trout magnet was alone on the fridge, and Walter did not replace what it held, because some spaces are better empty than filled with the wrong thing. Walter was standing in the hallway in front of the wall where Helen's photograph had hung since the funeral. He was holding a small black frame. He adjusted it so it sat level, the kind of level that only matters to a man who spent 34 years in quality control, a man who could spot a deviation of a 1/16 of an inch, and who believed that if something was worth putting on a wall, it was worth putting on straight. He adjusted it 3 times. He stepped back, he checked it, Helen's face on the left, the 5 digits on the right. The woman who had been his compass for 39 years, and the number that marked the day he had been lost and found again. Sunday. Tyler came over for dinner, the way he did most Sundays now, more often since the kitchen table conversation, more often since the day he pulled the email from his pocket and admitted what he had been carrying. The Sunday calls had become Sunday dinners. Tyler brought groceries. Walter cooked. It was a new routine, and Walter was a man who needed routines the way other men needed air. Tyler brought pork chops, potatoes, and green beans. Walter cooked them the way Helen had taught him. The pork chops seared in the cast iron, the potatoes roasted with rosemary from the garden bed, the green beans steamed with a little butter and salt. It was Helen's recipe. It was one of the 4 recipes Walter knew, and he rotated them every Sunday with the same reliability he had brought to every other routine in his life. Tyler never complained. Tyler never suggested variety. Tyler ate what his father cooked, and he said, "That's good, Dad." And Walter said, "It's your mother's recipe." And the acknowledgement hung in the air between them like a prayer neither of them knew how to say. Tyler saw the frame. He was walking down the hallway to wash his hands before dinner, and he saw it. The small black frame next to his mother's photograph. The 5 digits on white cardstock. No context, no explanation. He stopped. "What's that number?" Walter said it from the kitchen. He said it the way he said things that mattered, without looking at the person he was saying them to, without making a performance of it, without pausing to check whether the words were right, because the words had been waiting for 3 weeks, and they were ready and they did not need editing. He said it while turning the pork chops in the cast iron, his back to the hallway, his voice carrying through the kitchen doorway to the place where his son stood looking at 2 frames on a wall. "That's the day your girl saved my life." Time. He stood in the hallway and looked at his mother's face and the 5 digits and the 2 frames hanging level on the wall. Level because his father would not have it any other way. And he understood something he had not understood before. He understood that this was his father's way of saying, "She belongs here. She belongs in this house, next to the people I love. She is part of this family." Walter did not say those words. He would never say those words. He was a man who expressed love through actions so small and precise that you had to know him to see them. A frame hung straight, a shirt ironed for a dinner, a pot of coffee made for a woman who came to his kitchen table with a legal pad and a recorder and treated him like a man who mattered. He expressed love the way he expressed everything, through maintenance, through care. Through the windshield, the strip mall parking lot was empty and ordinary, and no different from the day she had pulled in and seen an older man gripping his steering wheel and talking to someone who was about to ruin his life. The parking lot did not know what had happened in it. Parking lots never do. They are just asphalt and painted lines, and the silent witnesses to the 10,000 small and large moments that happen between people and cars every day. She exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that carries 12 days of silence, 6 weeks of anxiety, 8 seconds of recognition across a white tablecloth, and the weight of being seen by a man who did not want to be seen and chose to see her back. "Tell him I said thank you," Tyler said. "I think he already knows." She started her shift. She looked at the place where she had stood at the passenger window and asked one question that changed 2 lives. Then she accelerated. She finished the route. She went home. On the hallway wall of a brick ranch house on Westwood Avenue, 2 frames hung side by side, level. A photograph. 4 days. That is how long it takes for a Tuesday afternoon in a parking lot to become a Saturday evening at a dinner table. 4 days between saving a stranger's life savings and discovering that the stranger is the only person in the world whose opinion of you matters more than your badge, your record, or your 7 years on the force. Grace Currigan did not know she was about to meet her future father-in-law. She was doing her job. She was driving a route. She was looking through windshields the way she looked through windshields every shift, with the trained attention of a woman who had decided, 7 years ago, that the best use of a badge was not authority, but presence. I want to be careful about what this story means, because it would be easy to call it a coincidence. A young cop helps an old man, and he turns out to be her future father-in-law. And isn't that something? But I don't think coincidence is the right word. I think the word is readiness. Grace Kerrigan pulled into that parking lot because she was trained to see distress. She approached from the passenger side because she had learned that dignity opens more doors than authority. She asked 3 questions instead of giving 3 orders because 3 years on the community beat had taught her that people respond to being seen, not to being commanded. She was ready. She had been getting ready for 7 years. And Walter
Walter Keene was a proud man who had spent 67 years building walls so high and so carefully maintained that nobody could see over them, including himself. He was a man who believed that needing help was a failure, that asking for help was worse, and that being helped by a young woman half his age was the worst thing he could imagine. Until it happened, and the young woman turned out to be the person his son loved.
That is the question of a man who is not asking for pity or forgiveness. That is the question of a man who wants to understand, who wants to learn, who wants to make sure that what happened to him does not happen to someone else. That question is the moment Walter Keene stopped being a victim and started being a partner. And the partnership they built, the case file on the kitchen table, the 43 pages, the documentation that became the backbone of a federal prosecution, that partnership was not built on gratitude, it was built on respect. The respect of a quality control supervisor who recognized competence when he saw it, and the respect of a patrol officer who recognized dignity when she saw it, and the mutual understanding that the best thing you can do for a person you have saved is to let them save someone else. That is the whole story. A strip mall parking lot, a phone call that took 12 days to make. And then he said, from the kitchen with his back turned, while the pork chops seared in the cast iron, "That's the day your girl saved my life. I figure Helen should know." That is how Walter Keene says, "I love you." That is how a man who has not said the words in 6 years finds a way to say them without saying them. A frame on a wall, a number in a frame, a photograph beside it. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who is too proud to ask for help, or someone who is afraid to offer it, or someone who is sitting in a dark kitchen, staring at a business card on the refrigerator and wondering whether the voice on the phone is telling the truth, share this with them. Do not wait for the right moment. The right moment is now. The right moment was always now. Subscribe so you do not miss the next story.
There are more Walters out there, and more Graces, and every one of them deserves to be heard. Grace Currigan pulled into a strip mall parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon because an older man in a pickup truck looked like he was having a hard conversation. She did not know his name. She did not know his son. She did not know that 4 days later he would be sitting across from her